Welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Dom Morley, and if you're not familiar with Dom, Dom is a British engineer and producer who in 2008 won the Record of the Year Grammy Award for Amy Winehouse's Back to Black album. And in addition to working with Amy Winehouse, he's worked with a ton of other great artists, including Sting, Adele, Kate Walsh, The Police, Jeff Beck, and a whole bunch more. And in today's conversation, we have a great chat about vocal mixing and how to get vocals to stand out in a mix. And Dom does a great job in this interview of outlining his process of how he starts a mix to make sure that the music wraps around the vocal and that the vocal is the focal point of the mix, but everything else seems to just work around it and give the vocal its own space so that the vocal has the listener's attention throughout the track. So if you struggle to get your vocals to sound clear in your mix, I think you're going to find a lot of great value from this episode here today. So without further ado, let's just jump right into this episode. Dom Morley, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. How's it going, man?
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, all good.
Awesome. For people who might not be familiar with you or your background and all the cool things that you're up to these days, can you give us that story?
Okay. This, I guess the headline is Grammy-winning engineer-producer. You have to get that bit in. It sort of becomes part of your name after you've got one because everyone introduces you with that at the beginning. And I have worked with artists like Amy Winehouse, which is where I won the Grammy for, and also Adele, Sting. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I always find this really difficult. If you go to dommorley.com, I've got it on the website and it says everything. Latest news, I do a lot of work with a jazz trumpeter called Ibrahim Malouf, who is a Parisian but born in Lebanon. And he does very interesting stuff, got really interesting, I think it's a 4-valve trumpet. There's something quite different about what he does. And he did an album with a woman called Angelique Kidjo just recently, who's a massive kind of world music singer. And that's just been the album. I mixed it for them at the beginning of the year, and it's just been nominated for a Grammy for Best World Music Album. So
amazing.
We were all big fingers crossed for that to come off because she's got loads. She's got 5 Grammys. She doesn't need any more. But Ibrahim definitely deserves one because he's amazing. So yeah, I'm hoping that comes off.
That's amazing. And then, hopefully you can call yourself multiple Grammy-winning engineer.
Yeah, I get to put the word multiple at the front of my name then.
Amazing. Well, how did you get into music and ultimately into production?
Into music, actually, there's an album called Surfer Rosa by Pixies, which was the album that got me into being in a band. And it's an incredible record if you don't know it. It sounds so raw and yet just amazing. It was a band at their height, at their powers, and Steve Albini did a great job on producing it. And actually, I have I have a little thing of the album cover that sits on top of my speakers to remind me I'm supposed to be doing what that did to me. You know, it's the stuff that I work on. I want to be making people feel like that made me feel. So that's what got me into being in a band. And then I was about 14 at that point. And then I kind of wanted to record us in our attempts at making music. And so this was like, I think early 90s. So I bought a Porter Studio, which is like a cassette multi-track, 4-track thing. So I bought that and had a lot of fun. So then I kind of upgraded that to an 8-track reel-to-reel and bought it was an Atari ST, was the cutting edge of computer audio. Sorry, not computer audio, because there was no audio, MIDI sequencing. And set up a little bedroom studio a la 1993 or whatever it was. And I just loved doing that. I realized I wasn't really that into being in a band. It was kind of fun, but not my thing. But I loved playing with sound and trying to get things sound great. So then when it came to needing to work and being of that age, I went knocking on doors of studios and saying, I'll work for nothing, I'll make good tea, thinking that this is my surefire way of getting a gig.
The right pitch, right?
Yeah, it didn't work. Well, it eventually worked. I spent days walking around London looking at all these studios and trying to get in and offering my services for nothing, and they weren't interested. So then I went to Birmingham, which is like the next biggest city in the UK, And somebody there said, yeah, all right, see you Monday. So then I worked there, like work experience just for nothing for as long. I think I gave myself about a 3-month or 4-month limit, and then I ran out of cash, so I'd have to go and do something paid. But fortunately, within that period, there was a studio also in Birmingham that was owned by the band UB40, and they were looking for a new assistant engineer, stroke runner kind of thing. And the guy that ran that studio, the engineer there, knew the producer that I was kind of helping out in this studio where I was. So I got recommended for the gig, and that was like my first proper job in studios. And then I was there for about 2.5 years, and it was great time. It was a smallish studio, like 2 rooms, but one of them had an SSL in it. You know, it was small but decent. But it was enough to learn loads. And when you're in a small studio, not in like the hypercenter of like London, New York, LA, kind of Nashville world, you get to do a lot more a lot earlier. So I was like engineering stuff after about six months of just turning up and not really knowing what I was doing. And to be fair, I don't think I really knew what I was doing on those first engineering sessions. I mean, I got signaled to tape, but I think it sounded awful. But they knew what they were doing. The clients knew, you got the new guy, it's cheap, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I was there for a couple of years, and then I moved down to London and managed to get a job at a studio called Metropolis, which is a really big one. It's like when I joined, that had 3 SSLs and even a Focusrite desk, 5 studios, loads of mastering rooms. So that was cool. And I was there for quite a few years. Started at the bottom again, worked my way up, but obviously smaller fish, bigger pool. And then went freelance from there, I think 12, 14 years ago, something like that. So I've been freelance for a little while. And I shared a studio with a mate. We rented one of the rooms that Metropolis has, so I was still in the building but client rather than employee. And then I moved out, and I've been out here in Oxfordshire for about 6 or 7 years now. This is like a brick outbuilding behind a massive house, like a stately home kind of massive house. And so there's nothing around, which saves me a fortune on soundproofing. I don't need to soundproof because there's nothing to soundproof against. Occasionally a horse walks past. That's it. That's the only noise
Amazing.
I have.
I love it.
So that's me, kind of a potted history of me up to now.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's always impressive to me when I hear people say that, you got an internship and, you managed to like work your way into a position, basically within months, you said, because I find that very interesting. Right? Like you always hear about the stories of people that are like, it was a year or 2 or whatever, but to get in that quickly is pretty impressive.
It was as much luck though, really, in that there was only one. I think there were 2 studios in Birmingham that actually had assistant engineer positions, and it just so happened that one of them came up while I was in town looking for a gig and sort of impressing people that I was with. Therefore, I got the recommendation over somebody else. So,
gotcha.
Bit of luck, bit of. I tell students, I'm also a professor at Leeds Conservatoire, and I tell students that half the job is putting yourself in a position to score. It's like that kind of the soccer analogy is like the main guy that scores all the goals, he might only be on the ball. Oh, in the middle of the World Cup, this is a perfect timing for this analogy. The main goal scorer, he might be only on the ball for 2 minutes out of 90, but the other 88, he's running around getting himself in a position to score so that when a good ball does finally come in, he gets it in the net. And most of the balls that come in are pointless. They end up the goalkeeper's on the game or it's not quite lands properly for you and so on. But as long as you're always getting yourself in a position to score, when everything else lines up, you do your bit and you score. And I've always found work to be like that. As long as you're always doing your very best at your bit, then when everything else lines up, it's going to be, it's going to do what it needs to do and it's going to do well. And you won't be the guy that meant it didn't happen. You know what I mean? But it means that when the opportunities swing your way, then you're able to take full advantage of them.
I love that. Yeah, that's so true. Because I do think that, there are a lot of studios that still do the free intern thing. And, it can be, for a lot of people, it's almost intimidating to even apply for these jobs. Like they know that they want to get into these studios, but it's kind of like you said, like, I only have so much money to last so long. So, it's like that there's like a kind of a bit of preparation that goes into it of like, how do I maximize this internship without being overly pushy or, like how do you get the most out of it? So as far as like that analogy that you said there, I love that analogy. I think it's very true. But what kind of things would you recommend people do to put themselves in that position to score? Like, how does someone stand out so that they can be ready for those opportunities?
Okay, I think there's two things. One is, I think fairly obvious, is just to be as helpful and as friendly as you can be, because I heard a great quote that was about Hollywood, but it applies everywhere. It's people hire the best person for the job that they like working with. And that last qualifier is really, really important.
That's a big one.
You've got to be somebody that a client or whoever it is that you hope to employ you wants to spend time in the room with, because they're going to have to. And if that isn't the case with you, then they're going to pick somebody else who is decent at it, maybe not as good as you, but pleasant to hang around with for 12 hours. So make sure you're being the friendly, helpful person as good as you can be. But the other thing is, and it was some advice I got very early on when I was assisting, was to be thorough. And the idea being that there aren't many transferable skills between an assistant engineer and an engineer. You know, you're setting up mics and stuff as an assistant, and you're running the tea and coffee, and you're just being kind of generally helpful and plugging stuff in. Whereas an engineer is tasked to get the right sounds, and that is a different gig. And equally, engineer to producer, there's a huge step between the guy who's got to get the right sounds and the guy who's got to draw the right performance out of an artist and all that sort of stuff. So in order to move up, you need to display, I think, a real ability to be thorough at whatever task you're given, so that whatever task, even if it's boring or demeaning, well, not demeaning, okay, let's skip that one, boring or you think it's below you or whatever it is, if it's the task you've been given, then you do your absolute best at it, so that the people that know you're ambitious then know that when they give you the next thing that might be a bit tricky, you're going to do it to absolutely the best of your ability, because that's what you always do. I made sure when I was at Metropolis that even when I was just making tea and coffee, I did it really well. I learned how to use the coffee machine really well. I was known for making the best hot chocolate in the building. And I have no interest in making good hot chocolate, and I never have. But I was known to be good at stuff. Give me a job and I'll do it well. That was what I wanted to be known as. And then that could pass on to give him a job of recording a vocal, give him a job of recording a drum kit, give him a job of mixing something, and I would do it well. So that's those are the two things, I think: being the friendly, helpful person as much as you can, but also being incredibly thorough about whatever task you've been given.
100%. Yeah, I agree with that. It's kind of funny because it reminded me of like one of my first internships that I had. Obviously coffee is a big thing at a studio, and you have to know how to make good coffee. And I was not a coffee drinker. So like, I didn't know if I was making it right or not, but I was always asking like everyone, like, how's your coffee? Do you need it stronger, lighter, whatever? I was always trying to gauge like, what is it that people want? And like, how do I like, alter the recipe and stuff just to get it perfect, But it's like, I'm not going to become a coffee drinker just to work in a studio, but it's like you said, like you have to be meticulous with it. You have to pay attention to those details and see what people want, right?
And also things like making a note if you're working with somebody of what they like, so that this was always the golden hit. Is like they'd come back 6 months later and you'd go, "Still milk and 2 sugars, yeah."
Yeah,
and you'd remember their coffee, and then they just feel like so looked after. They go, "Oh, this guy's great. I want this guy. This guy's brilliant." Just little things like that you can do to make somebody feel, like you really care about them and their staff and their work and their happiness. Then they want you to be the guy in the room.
It's so true. Like that. I mean, that's a small detail that is really important to people. Like if you were to just take a quick note of like how someone takes their coffee, and then make sure that when they come next time, they've got it all ready to go the way they want it. Like it's a small detail, but and some people listening to this might be like, what's this have to do with audio? But it's like, it's customer service. You know what I mean? And that's really what it comes down to. And if you're treating people the way they want to be treated, and you're making them feel actually special because you pay attention to their order and you want them to be satisfied and, have that great experience, and then they're going to keep coming back, and they're going to remember you as that person who paid attention to those details. And
if you want a gig in this world, then not only you've got to be good about the audio bit, but you've got to be good about the business bit as well. You've got to be able to do the business part of it. Otherwise, and if you're a hobbyist, then that's absolutely great, and there's no issues with that at all, and then you don't have to worry about it, just to worry about the audio. But if you want a gig, then you got to get both sides nailed.
Absolutely. Love that. So you had mentioned that you kind of just started off by like learning recording, and you got your porta studio and all that, and were you just teaching yourself at that point? Like how did you ultimately learn the engineering side of it? Was it just trial and error, and then once you got in the studio, you kind of watch other people?
Yeah, it was trial and error, and I'd get magazines. That's all there was in those days. It was pre-internet, so there wasn't really much, other opportunity to learn. So I'd do what I could from magazines, and I'd experiment with a lot of stuff. And then it was actually when I first started a little bit on that work experience. Although I wasn't really sort of touching anything, I was just trying to, be a helpful guy in the room. But then when I started actually working in a studio, it was a really quick learning curve. And they were throwing stuff at me to get me to learn things. And there was a guy there called Mike Exeter, who was the chief engineer, and I'm still friends with. And he was really helpful. And he was chief engineer. It was his job to teach me, but didn't have to put that much effort in, and he did. And so I was amazed actually at how quickly I did learn it. And there's really something to be said, which these days it's harder to get gigs in studios because there were fewer of them, but there were more college courses, which there weren't when I started. That was a really difficult option, trying to get on a college course about audio education. But the idea of just being immersed in something where everyone you're talking to is talking about that too, and everything, your whole life for a period of time is about one subject, is a hugely powerful education tool to just be immersed in one thing. So that meant I learned very quickly, but it was learning on the job. It was while I was there and watching other people and asking questions of the chief engineer who I could, not the clients, because they didn't want to be answering questions, but I could of the chief engineer.
Of course, yeah. I mean, it's surrounding yourself with the right people, right? When you're around people who are motivating you and they have things that you can learn from, like you're gonna absorb it very quickly.
Yeah.
So that definitely helps you propel into it. That's awesome. So yeah, eventually you got into the production side of things and recording bands and mixing them. I'd love to talk a little bit about the production side for yourself. When you go into producing an album, what's your normal approach when it comes to production? Like, how involved do you like to get? Because I know some people are all about like they want to get into the songwriting elements. Some people are like, that's not really my thing as a producer. So what do you view the role of a producer as?
Well, it's whatever's required, really. I mean, there's such a range now. Like old school. Like when I started out, I'm very old now. When I started out, it was the 90s or late 90s when I started working in studios, and even then, it was still the case where it's like everything was kind of demos were done. The song was written, and there was a good idea of what it was going to be, and then the producer got involved and shaped it from there. And there was a bit more of the kind of what they call the fifth band member kind of idea, with particularly with indie and rock, where you were sort of directing and shaping and suggesting and stuff like that, but you were, essentially trying to get the best out of the guys in the room, and get their best version of everything, which is still a very valid role for a producer if that's what the band requires. If it's that sort of band that just needs help realizing their ideas, then really that's what you want to do. And as much as possible, be sort of as invisible as possible, and draw out the band's ideas rather than, imprint your own on them. But then you can go all the way over to the idea that the producer is the guy that brings the backing track, brings the beat, and then somebody just sings on top of it. And that's their role as the artist, and the producer does everything else. And anything in between. So I sort of, I started out with doing more kind of band stuff and it being fifth member kind of role, which I still do if that's the right thing for the person that I'm working with or the band that I'm working with. But then I'll also do stuff where I've got when I do some more sort of poppy things, I'll often have like a lead vocal and a chord chart or something like that, and then we'll talk about influences and who do you want to sound like, what sort of instrumentation we're looking for, that sort of thing. Do we want to get string players in? Do we want a guitarist? Because I don't play guitar. And then I build a track from there. Live drums, or program them, and I'll produce a drummer to the track. Whether the artist can turn up or not, that's fine. And I'll build the whole backing track, and then they'll sing over the top. So I'm happy to do whatever's required to get the right album, really. And I think that's kind of where the gig is these days, to be honest. I think you'd struggle to say, I can't do either. I can't leave other people to play their instruments, or, I can't play anything or do anything. I can just tell you whether you've got it right or I think the way the future is going, you need to be able to kind of cover all aspects.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like I really do think that the role of the producer has changed significantly, and people's expectations of what a producer is have changed as well, right? I remember one of my early mentors, he always defined like the producer as like the accounting guy, like it was like he was the guy he would come to the sessions, make sure that everyone was getting paid, and make sure that they got the great performances and all that. But that was part of it that now we don't talk about, as a producer role.
True. I was first told when I asked about it. It was in the film world, a cross between the director and the producer of a film. Because in terms of the director, you've got to, deliver the vision and have an idea of where the whole thing's got to go. And you've got to pull in the right people at the right time. And you've got to make sure everybody's get paid like the producer in a film does. And, and it's that sort of crossover, which is less and less the case these days, I think. The film producer role of it is less and less the case.
Of course. But I think you're right, though. It's like there are still like a few different scenarios for a producer that an artist would need these days, right? And sometimes it is just like having that fifth member of the band to say like, let's change around the arrangement a little bit here and there. And then there's the people that, like you said, will come to you with just a skeleton of a vocal and maybe some chords and are like, turn it into a song. And that requires a different skill set than the other one, right? Because you really do have to improve your songwriting chops. Because at that point you're writing music. You're not just hitting record and trying to get the best takes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You got to be able to kind of at least to some extent, or be able to get the right people in.
Absolutely. So then, in your opinion, what ultimately makes a great song? Like when you're producing a song, how do you know that it sounds good and that it's in the best shape it can be?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Loaded question.
No idea. That's not something I've ever. That's something I've ever sort of verbalized. So I have to process kind of what I think that would be. I guess, I don't know. It's sort of, if it feels like it's moving in the way that it's supposed to, then I feel like we probably got it. It's like, I guess you've got the vocal. Let's assume it's a song, right? So you got the vocal and that's number one. That's the most important thing. And then how emotionally that's moving, guided by the lyrics and maybe by the performance that the singer's done, as how it's building and falling and where the light and shade hopefully needs to be. And then I guess the question is has that been delivered by what you've put on there? Is it the right sort of, the tones that you're using and the instrumentation that you've used, is that giving you the right feel, the right emotion to back up what the singer's doing? And if that's the case, then I think that's cool. I think that's you've done what you needed to do. But if there are holes, or if something doesn't feels like it's lacking, or if it's pushing it in the wrong direction emotionally, then you've still got work to do. So you got to change that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. You're ultimately just trying to create that connection between the audience and the song, and so the emotion is the important part that you're trying to. That is the connector, right? It is like the movement of the song and the feeling of the song. That makes a lot of sense. So then what would you say is like a common mistake that you see a lot of artists making before they enter the studio and, with their arrangements and that kind of stuff?
I think that it's a mistake to think, I don't get this much anymore. I have got it quite a few times in the past, to say, I don't know what I want, but I'll know when I hear it. That's the most expensive phrase I've ever heard. Because that means
I like that you said expensive.
We have to try everything until you get to what you want. So what I maybe the reason why I don't hear that anymore, because I have a plan for it. And what I do is, I said, before we start, I ask for a Spotify or whatever playlist of up to sort of a dozen tracks of, these need to be songs that you want to sit amongst, that your track or your album could be on a playlist with these songs, and they would work like that. And then what that means is we know roughly what the instrumentation needs to be, what the feel of the album's going to be, how loud the vocal needs to be in the mix, or what kind of reverbs. There's often a lot of those cues will come when an artist has to make those sort of decisions. And for some, it's quite simple, because that's the way they've planned their project, is by thinking, what do I need to sound like? Who else am I going to sound like? So it's like, oh yeah, okay, these three albums are the ones that I think. And for some, they've never thought of it before. and it's quite a challenge. But that challenge is much easier done at home with your finger on the forward button of a streaming service than in a studio with musicians that are being paid and the studio that's being paid trying to work out what you're supposed to be sounding like, because there's no need to do it in a studio. You can work that out on your own at home, and that will save you an enormous amount of time and money. So I'd say that's probably the biggest mistake, is somebody that hasn't had that, gone through that process of what do I want this project to sound like? Because then all you've got to do is everyone's got to get in and deliver that. And that's much more straightforward and there's still plenty of scope for experimentation within that. Once, a playlist of 12 songs doesn't define you at all. It just gives everybody signposts. And when you get stuck, like if I'm stuck on a production and I've put a few things down, I'm like, I don't know what else to put on this, but it's not done yet. I'll listen to the playlist and then there'll be 3 things that will come into my head and go, oh, it's something a bit like, but not quite. But if I did that on the Wurlitzer instead of a string part, that might be quite cool, and it feeds into those ideas, which if you don't have those signposts, you've just got, it can be forever trying to narrow something down to make it sound like a coherent project.
Of course. Yeah. I think that's a really good point to bring up, because you need to have that vision for your tracks, not just from a songwriting perspective, but also that having that clear vision really dictates the path you follow with every element of the production process, whether it's, the instruments that you record because you want to get a similar sound, or like the arrangements to, make it sound as wide as the songs you want them to sound like. Even from a mixing perspective too, it's going to help dictate, how loud the vocal should be versus the guitar and that kind of stuff. So it really does make a lot of sense to come up with this vision of what your song should sound like before you start, because otherwise you're just, trying to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, and that's not really a way to ultimately find the sound that you wanted. It's kind of
and it's not a creative process that as well. It's just tedious that people get frustrated and confused and then annoyed, and it doesn't lend to the barriers of these songs are what we want to be like. It feeds the creativity because it just gives you some kind of, the having too many options is a killer of creativity. But also it's a process for deciding what sort of artist you are as well. That you should have an idea of who you are. That shouldn't be the producer's decision to decide what sort of artist you are. You should be able to know for your own authenticity is to know what sort of artist you are. And for your first album, that's important to get that established and go, I am this kind of artist. Let's make a record. And then for subsequent albums, it's like, I was this on my last album and I am now moving in this direction because this is how I've changed as a person or how we've changed as a band, and now we're doing, we're referencing that stuff that we did last time round, but we're now listening to this and we want to be in this territory too. And all that stuff is really, I don't understand anyone that leaves that to the producer to make that decision. I think that's mad. This is you. This is your art. Why are you getting somebody to tell you what you should sound like? It's supposed to be the other way around.
Yeah.
You tell them how you want to sound and they'll make it happen.
Of course. And I also think that there's a lot of artists too that they just are afraid to admit that they sound alike to someone else, like there's a lot of people, there's a lot of people that are just like, oh, I'm so unique. Like, I don't know what my music sounds like. And then it's like, come on, like you're not that special of a snowflake. You sound like this person or whatever,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So by having that idea of what you want it to be, then it just makes the process smoother for everyone. And you can have those goalposts to know when you're in the right area and you're on track and from your producer will understand what you want, your mixing engineer will understand what you want. It really does make sense to do that. So I love that exercise of just getting someone to make a playlist for that, because you'll always find something that at least inspires you or that you you want it to sound similar to.
Yeah.
So then what about when it comes to mixing then, like, are you using reference tracks for your mixes as well? Like, do you frequently listen to that kind of stuff too? Exactly
the same. What, and what I do as well, I do say is like, send me a bunch of tracks that you want this to sound like, and also tell me why each track's on there. Just a sentence as to why that track's on there. And if it's just for the vibe, then that's fine. That's a good enough explanation. And I do that because one time, before I used to do that little qualifying question, there was a track that was in the playlist that I'd been sent, and it had this, I think it was like this really reverby drum sound that I thought, that sounds really cool, right? And that's obviously, what they're into. So I did that, and it turned out that track was on there because they like the vocal reverb and they hated the drum sound. So it's like, oh, I should know this before I start. So yeah, and you normally, if you get things like it's just the vibe, if you get 3 of those, they kind of normally sound sort of together, and it's probably something like a vocal reverb or something that's the same. And it's just, the artist isn't able to pick that out of the mix, which isn't their job, so it's fine. But they haven't been able to identify that, which as a mix engineer, you can go, okay, I can hear the similarity and I know what they've done. They've got this big hall on everything. So, those sort of things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That really does help to find the thing that people actually want, as opposed to, again, just leaving it up to the producer to figure out what's the coolest element of this reference track they gave me.
Yeah, because back in the old days, when everybody had to work on analog in studios, the artist would be with you. So you could go, this kind of reverb, are you digging this? And then they could say yes or no, and the decision's made, and you're getting what they want. Whereas when you've got a mix on your own and then just send it to them, there's 1,000 creative decisions you make in the process of the mix. And if, I'm not going to check with them on every one because that would just be tedious for them. So if I can get signposts from a few sort of few tracks on a playlist as this is the sort of stuff we like, then I go, okay, I'll try and get as much of the stuff that you like into this mix. And then hopefully I'm gonna get it pretty close to where you want it to be.
For sure. So that sounds like it's one of the first things that you would typically do before you start a mix, just to get those goalposts in. So then what's your mindset going into a mix? Like, how do you typically start? Do you have a similar process that you follow with every mix? What's that look like?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I'll also, if I can, I'll check their last rough mix, so you've got an idea of, whether this is a piano-led track or guitar-led track or, whatever. Those sort of little balance things, which are probably going to reveal themselves in the last rough mix I did. And then I actually start by making sure I know. I have this thing about the presence of a vocal, of the lead vocal, which generally is somewhere between sort of 2 and 3.5K. Most voices will have like a little bit of. There'll be a point where they're quite present. So I do a little sort of sweep around with an EQ around that point on a boost, and just see if there's a point where it feels like they've stepped forward a bit, and then it's like that's going to be the important frequency for that voice because that's where their presence is. And then I make a note of it and then sort of close the lead vocal off and start with the drums. But every instrument will have a dip at that frequency, with the idea being that I can build the mix up quite nicely and know the vocal is already going to be sitting in there to an extent because the hole has already been made. With the vocal being the most important thing, whatever the most important frequency is for the vocal, nothing else gets to be there. Like it's always going to win that battle. If there's a battle at that point, say it's 2.5K. If there's a battle at 2.5K, the vocal wins because that's the vocal and that's its spot. So, so that's always my first bit is try and work out where the vocal needs to be. And then I just, kick, see how that's working with the bass, then do the rest of the drums, and then bring the bass in and sort of finalize that with a kick and just sort of add things as I go along and in a kind of try and do it in kind of order like kick, bass, and then whatever is providing the rhythm in the instrument, like maybe rhythm guitar, acoustic guitar, piano, whatever it is that's providing the rhythm there. So you've got that kind of building up as a backing track and then building on that. And then finally the vocal, and then I put the backing vocals on around the lead once the lead's in there and in the right place. So that's sort of the order that I do things in pretty much.
That's cool. Yeah, I like that approach of like finding that key frequency range for the vocal. You said like 2.5 to 3.5K or so. Like that is a range where there's a lot of information on a lot of different tracks there. Like, you're going to get your stick definition and all that kind of stuff with the drums. So, like, are you actually cutting in that frequency on like all the tracks, or is it just like specific ones that, okay.
Unless like if it's a bass that's a sub bass, then I don't need to because there's nothing there anyway. But yeah, snare's going to have a hole in it there. So are the guitars. They're all going to have at least a 2-3 dB dip, Q of about 2 to 3 at that point where the vocal needs to be. Because they're all important, but they're not as important as the vocal. Fair. So they can have other space. They're like also like for example, a vocal doesn't sound. Often I find vocals don't sound very nice in the kind of 4.5-5K area. That's quite hard for a voice. But the crack of a snare and the cut of an electric guitar sounds really good there. So they can have that bit. The guitars can have the wide bit of that. Snare can have the bit in the middle. I'm going to dip the vocal there because, it's sounding a bit hard anyway, so we can give that over to the snare because the vocal's got its main present bit there, and so on. It's like that whole ballet of EQ moving around to make space for things and as you add them and try and find their place where they're comfortable. But that's the vocals always got to win at that point. It's actually the point of the where human hearing is the most sensitive is that vocal area between about 1 and 4K, I think. So that's why you've got to be so careful around there and put so much effort into that little bit of mid range, is because that makes so much a difference to our hearing because we're so sensitive to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of people talk about, how mixing, you want to be mixing for the mid range and making sure that that's the thing you master, because, that's the thing that you're going to hear on every set of speakers is that mid range. And
well, that's why I think so. I've got NS10s, and this is my theory on why NS10s are popular, or not for the same reason, is they give you loads of that kind of area. Like they're quite pokey in that mid range area, which means they sound a bit horrible, and they're quite tiring. But also because they give you loads in that area, you're able to get into quite a lot of detail in getting those, lead guitar, vocal, violins, snare, all that stuff working together really well because you've been given so much detail by the NS10s. And then when you pop them into some real speakers that actually sound okay, the mid-range is like really sorted, really crystal clear because you've had this kind of NS10 magnifying glass on the bit around the vocals. But, that's why they work for me. Like other people just hate them, so that's fair enough.
Yeah. I definitely have a love-hate relationship with them. Like I find that like my ears just get tired after listening to music on NSNs. But I do understand why people love them. And for me, I've just taken the approach of like I have a little Ortone speaker, the little mix cubes, and like that to me is my mid-range checker.
Very similar deal to the NS10s.
But you have to always be paying attention to that mid-range because it is really important, and that's where you're going to get the vocal clarity and all that other stuff comes in that range.
All the lead instruments are going to be there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you start off with vocals and that you pocket everything like that, because that was one of the things that really stood out to me when I listened to your mixes, is that I found your vocals always seem to sit very clear in the mix. So it kind of makes sense that that's your approach there. Are there any other tips that you have for getting vocals to sound really clear in a track?
I don't know. That's kind of the thing that I do automatically. I guess the only other thing that I do that I think kind of works quite well, which I don't know if everybody does with vocals. Maybe I might be saying something really obvious here, but I like to think in terms of scenes with a vocal in the effects. So I'll have a bunch of different parts of the song, and I'll have 2 different reverbs, 2 different delays, and they'll be necessary for different parts of the song depending on how close or far I want the vocal to feel and how affected, how wide, how narrow. So it might be a verse part, or maybe there's a middle 8 where I want it to be really intimate and that to be quite a dramatic moment that it will pull it in. So then I'll lose everything, or just have a small room or something that's on there for a little bit of realism without it going too dry. And then the chorus will be the big hall scene or the large plate scene. So that will come in and out for the chorus. And then there'll be delays that I use to either add width and interest, by having an obvious delay thing going on in between moments, or it might just be that delay is kind of a subtle stereo delay that ends up almost sounding like a reverb. It's like lots of repeats, very fast, and it's just doing something slightly different to the reverb. That means a few words within a chorus get even bigger, or a few words within a verse are thrown back a little bit, and there's just that constant kind of shift around the vocal of the space that the vocal's in, which makes it kind of quite interesting and keeps the interest of throughout the mix, because you're never quite sure what's going to be coming. But then in terms of clarity, actually, there's quite a little tip on clarity there is with big reverbs. Like with the vocal, you kind of still want the vocal to be, normally you still want the vocal to be close to you, even though it might be in a big reverb. And the more reverb you add, the further away the vocalist disappears into the back of the hall. But if you put a pre-delay on your reverb, then it actually keeps the vocal kind of up the front with the hall being behind it. The sort of psychoacoustic thing of that being that singer is still next to you, in front of you, and the time it's taking for the reverb to come back to you is suggesting that the size of the hall and the difference space between the vocalist and the back wall, basically. So use of a pre-delay means you can kind of get bigger reverbs without losing your singer. And the more you add, just the bigger the room gets behind them rather than the further back they travel in it. So that can be, if you've not used that before, that can be quite a nice little maneuver to keep your vocal nice and clear while putting a load of space around it.
For sure. That's a great tip. Yeah, I know a lot of people will talk about just, whether you should even use reverb with vocals or if you can just get away with delay, because sometimes delay will give you a cleaner version of it, right? Where you still have that depth.
It's smaller. Yeah, it takes up less room, which is cool. So I kind of use a combination. Also, what can be quite useful I've been doing lately is de-essing the send to the reverb. So it's got a little bit less of the sibilance in the send, which means I find I can use a bit more, use a brighter reverb and not be thrown by the essing. So I might have a de-esser on the vocal anyway, but then the reverb channel will have a de-esser plugin and then the reverb plugin, so that it's a little bit less that's going to the verb.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like that. That's a cool approach. Because definitely, sometimes you want that bright reverb, but if you've got tons of S's, then it gets pretty annoying pretty quickly.
Big. Yeah. But it means you can keep the size, without it getting too splashy.
Of course, yeah. You'd mentioned that you like to think of your effects as scenes. Do your effects only live in certain sections of the song, or do you kind of blend them all together and just have different balances between a verse and a chorus?
Different balances, yeah. So there may be 2 or 3 in the chorus that are all going, and then only 1 in the verse and a couple in the pre-chorus and stuff like that. So yeah, it's not like there will be it'll only be there and nothing else is allowed to be in that section. It will grow and shift and drop as the song goes on. And the idea really being it's there's the novelty and repetition, is how we enjoy music, and there's got to be something new, or rather you've got to be listening to the song and not know how it's going to finish. There's enough novelty that's going on through the song that you don't think, okay, I know the rest now. I know what's going on. You've got to always be thinking, well, there's always these little things that, this will be a subconscious conversation, but there's always these little things that keep coming up that I wasn't expecting. And they don't need to be dramatic because there still needs to be the repetition. That means that's how humans attach themselves to music. But with the novelty, it means I can introduce this effect kind of process means I can introduce novelty in with the vocal channel as well. And it's just another little element that you can use to bring that in and make the track interesting and encourage people to listen to the end.
Makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. I like the idea of blending things because, if you have completely different effects in different sections and, sometimes it can seem like too drastic of a shift between a verse and a chorus. So, by at least having that blend, you're kind of familiar with that sound already. It's a little bit of a smoother transition for things.
The repetition novelty again.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. Definitely, like I said, vocals were one of the things that really stood out to me with your productions. One thing that I remember hearing in an interview you did, you mentioned that in particular, more so when you're recording vocals, that you always prefer to work with the artists in the same room as you, as opposed to having them in a different room or in a booth. And I'm curious to know, how does that impact, or why is that, first off?
Because I think it's quite, I kind of, as much as possible, try and take them on an emotional journey when they're singing, because that's the crux of the performance is them emoting whatever the lyric happens to be. So it can be, it can be a challenge, and I will be pushing them to be more in the moment and more, emoting whatever the lyric is requiring. And I find it easier to do that and to be with them on that journey if we're in the same room and we can just take the headphones off or take an ear off and have a conversation. Whereas if you're doing it over a talkback button and they're in a room on their own, I just don't feel like we're doing it together. You know what I mean? I feel like I'm just dictating something to them and then they've got to try and work it out on their own. And I just find it's easier to get the intensity of performance and essentially the intensity of relationship between me and the artist at that point of getting a vocal good and really getting the emotion out of it. It's just easier if we're sat here looking at each other and chatting rather than separated by glass and wood and stone.
Makes sense.
That's just how I've always done it. So my studio here doesn't have a booth. I just have there's a mic stand in the corner and you sing there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of like before we started recording, we were talking about having video on the Zoom call, and it's the same kind of idea. When you see someone face to face, there's definitely a connection there, as opposed to just staring at a blank screen or whatever.
Yeah, it's like there's some psychological thing where communication is like 60% body language and 30% tone of voice, and then only 10% the actual words that you say. So the amount that we get out of these, this actually seeing people and stuff. I realize that's the reason why I don't like phone calls. It's because I'm not getting the body language bit, So I feel like I'm not properly communicating, and I much prefer video calls, which upsets everybody because I'll video call people instead of phone calling them, and nobody wants that apart from me because I feel we communicate better.
That makes sense. Hey, I mean, you've seen it time and time again in your own productions to know that does something for you, and
yeah, that's where the communication is in the whole experience. Yeah.
For sure. As far as creating or like dialing in your settings for vocals when you're recording, I'd imagine that having a singer in the same room as you can create some challenges because you're probably not monitoring through a big set of monitors. You're probably just listening on headphones. So how does that impact your decision-making process when it comes to creating or dialing in your settings to get the right sound?
I do very little, basically. So I'll pick a mic and normally to sort of record some stuff on like 3 mics. I think one of these is going to be it. And then play that back so I can hear that properly. And then once that's chosen, it will be, mic pre and perhaps just a tiny bit of compression, but really it will just be a tiny bit. And that's it. I'll do as little as I can get away with, basically, because for, like you say, I can't monitor it properly, can't monitor it that clearly. And also, I don't want to be concentrating on the sound. I want to be concentrating on the performance. When you're engineering and producing, I think engineering always goes by the wayside to producing because that's the more when the two are on offer, that's the more important gig because you can't fix a bad performance, and sometimes you can fix a recording that isn't perfect. So so that's how I do as little as I can.
That's a really good point because I do think people tend to get very fixated on the technical side of things when they're recording because they're thinking like, oh, this is my one shot to get it right and to make it to save myself work later on if I I get this perfect sound now. So, but you're right. Like at the end of the day, it's like if you get the better performance, that's really the thing that matters. You'll make it work no matter what.
Yeah, there's nothing that will make your mix easier than a great performance. That's the thing that will make everything fall together easier, and the whole thing will sound a lot better if there's a great performance. So that's always the thing that I would want to focus on, both for an engineering and a production, angle. It's like the performance has got to be great. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because there's always that debate of like, how much should you be committing in the recording stage? And, there's that balance there too.
Now that's one where I actually stand on I prefer to decide. So it's things like, guitars. I had this recently with a guy who was in here and he was recording a guitar. And we got a sound, got a couple of pedals, amp, and I've got an amp and mic'd it up and all that sort of stuff. And it's like, yep, that's the sound we want. Sounds great. And he said, are you going to record a DI? I said, no. He said, oh, because normally I record a DI. So what? So I said, look, well, if you're not happy with the sound, we'll change it. Like, let's get the right sound, and then we don't need to record a DI. And then he got fixated on it, so I recorded a DI anyway, and then didn't use it because we had got the sound that we wanted. But I'm very much up for that kind of and that's a process. Recording guitars, like I don't need to worry about it having to be on headphones and not being able to hear what I'm doing. In that scenario, I want to record the sound. And when I record drums, I'll get the mics up that I need, and I've recorded drums, and then I'm happy with the drum sound. And I guess I've been engineering for quarter of a century now, so those things are a bit more straightforward to me than they were 15 years ago. So I can kind of do that with confidence and not worry too much. But yeah, I always try, and if I can, I'll commit and decide this is what it is, and then I'll work with that. Yeah,
it makes sense. Yeah, and especially if you're mixing your own music that you've recorded, you've done it so many times that you kind of already know how you're going to process it later on, that you can feel pretty confident that this is going to work for me.
This is a good guitar sound. I like this sound, and I'm sure I'll be able to make this work in the mix. This will be great.
Yeah, it might be like would your approach change if someone else were mixing the songs?
Nope. Deal with it. This is my guitar sound. I like it. Mix it.
Yeah, love it.
Yeah. If I wanted a different guitar sound, I would have recorded a different guitar sound.
Fair, yeah. Another thing I was curious to ask you about was that I heard in another interview that you'd mentioned that when it comes to your mixes, the way you tend to work is that you'll tend to make the mix on one set of monitors and get it sounding great, and then you'll switch to another set of monitors, kind of reevaluate the mix, and then make the changes on those, and then you'll switch to another set of monitors and kind of repeat that process over and over again until you feel like it's done. So that sounds like it's your process, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, my question with that is that every set of monitors is going to sound very different. So what do you do to ensure that your mixes are translating as opposed to just making the mix sound as best as they can on a specific set of monitors?
Well, so this is why I do it, really, is because I've got 2 different sets of speakers. I've actually got 3 because I've got the Avantones, which I use a little bit, but not loads. But I've got the NS10s, I've got Neumann's, the 310s, and I've got Grado headphones, and I've got Ronson Audio headphones. So I figure all 4 of those, they are chosen because they're sort of complementary. You know, they do sound different to each other. The Neumanns and the NS10s are not the same. And same with the Grados and the Rossons. They sound very different. And so the translation comes by the fact that when I start flicking between them and it sounds the same, you know, the mix is sounding the same between NS10s and Neumann, sounds the same. Headphones on, sounds the same. I'm not hearing any problem. I'm not hearing any problems for a start as part of the mixing process, but I know if it sounds basically the same as I jump between, then I'm kind of there. And that does develop over the process of the mix. At the start of the mix, they'll sound very different across the different speakers. The mix will sound different, but as they get closer and closer to the end point, they start sounding more and more similar, and the speakers start mattering less which ones I'm on. So that seems to work for me. It's the fact that I use 4 that are chosen to be different. You know.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because, I mean, it's. I think that's one of the issues that a lot of people, especially in like the home recording world, have is that the idea of translation, like a lot of people just don't have a good grasp on that yet. And it's not so much about making it sound great on one set of speakers because it's not everyone's going to listen on that one set of speakers.
No.
So, yeah, I think your approach to having different sounding speakers really does give you that kind of baseline of like, am I hearing problems like on one set of speakers versus another? And once everything's sounding consistent, then your mix should translate well outside of the studio.
Probably just came to me. The reason why I probably don't use the Avantones that much is because they're close to the NS10s. So they're not offering me much more information than the NS10s are. You know, I'm kind of getting that from the NS10s and then I'm moving on. I'm hearing the Avantones and going, yeah, that's what I thought. You know, whereas I'll go from NS10s to Neumanns and go, ooh, okay, got a couple of things to do in the 300 hertz area or something like that. You know, something will come out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I do think it's one of the reasons why a lot of people do the car test as well. It's because like most people don't have a sub in their studio.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's another set of speakers they know really well, and they can, and it will be different to their studio speakers, and you know, get in there, make some notes, and get a reference from there. Yeah, but you know, and arguably anything would work that would be, you know, that you know reasonably well. Home hi-fi would work. Yeah, and anything you know reasonably well that you can make some notes on and try and get it to translate to.
Yeah, I mean, we all have so many sets of speakers around us, whether it's just like the little iPhone speaker or you know, a couple of studio monitors, your laptop, whatever. Like, there's so many different ways that we could check out our mixes. So I think it is important for people to do that as opposed to just mixing it on one set of speakers and calling it a day and hoping it works.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very optimistic there.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a reason why when you look at like pictures of mastering studios, they have tons of speakers and like hi-fi stuff and boom boxes and all that kind of stuff. It's just like, you got to make sure it works.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right on. Well, Dom, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but if people want to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, there's a couple of places. So dommorley.com, which is just my website about, you know, me as a mixer and all that sort of thing. But also I run a service called the Mix Consultancy, which if they want to go a bit deeper with me, that might be quite useful. In that you can upload your mixes there and I give you a load of feedback on what I would do if I were presented with this track at this moment. So yeah, if you want to sort of learn mixing with me, then that's the place to be. There's also like a blog page of loads of stuff that I've written either for myself, or I write a lot for the website, the production expert. Or Pro Tools expert, or whatever particular expert you go to.
All the experts
on the same page. Yeah, Logic expert, same page. But yeah, I do a lot of writing for that. So there's loads you can read on there if you want to read on my opinions on various things, or you can upload a mix and we'll get your mixes better. I've also done a course on that you can do on recording vocals because I'm obsessed with that. So if you want to be as obsessed as I am with recording vocals, you can do my course.
Amazing. Right on, man. Well, thanks you again for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. I think it gives a lot of great insight on your process, and especially when it comes to vocals and stuff like that. Like I said, that's your jam there, man. Like that's where I found like you really nail it, and learning more about your process with that I found that very fascinating. So thank you.
Cool.
So that was my chat with Dom Morley, and I really enjoyed that. I thought it was really interesting to learn more about his vocal process and how simple it is for him just to get his vocals to sit properly in the mix. And all it takes is just a simple EQ move that he does at the beginning of his process that then sets himself up for success as he moves on with the rest of the mix. And it's something so simple, but a lot of us forget about that when we're mixing, we're just trying to give each track its own slot within the mix. And we have to prioritize what elements are the most important. And for Dom, it's clearly the vocals. But, beyond that, once you start to fit everything around the vocal, you still have to prioritize things like, should the snare be more important in a certain section or the guitars? Or should the keyboards be louder or the background vocals, that kind of thing. So you have to prioritize what the most important element of every section of the song is, and then make your decisions based around that. And from there, it's going to help guide your EQ decisions to make sure that you've got everything sitting in the right slot and that you've made room for the most important element of that section of the song. So I love that approach, and I think it's an important lesson to keep in mind next time you go to mix your tracks and you're trying to get the important elements of your song to have clarity. So yeah, I really enjoyed this episode. I hope that you did too. There was a lot of great stuff to take from this one. And fun fact about today's episode is that today's episode is scheduled to be released on January 18th, 2023. And as long as everything goes smoothly, that will be the date that it goes live. And this date is actually the due date of my very first baby being born. So if I sound tired in upcoming episodes, now you're going to understand. And I'm sure that all the parents listening to this are totally going to relate to what I'm talking about here. But this is a really fun adventure that I'm really looking forward to. And obviously, all the parents I know have been warning me, hey, you're not going to sleep, get ready. Telling you all the stuff that like you got to prepare for. And I'd like to think that I can handle it. I'm a bit of a night owl already, and I kind of function on little sleep to begin with. We'll see how things work out, but obviously it's something I'm super excited about and looking forward to it. So yeah, if all goes well, then as of today's date, I will be a dad, which is weird to say. But yeah, just super excited for it. Really looking forward to it. And with the birth of my baby, that doesn't mean that the podcast is going to be stopping. I've got a whole bunch of episodes in the bank. So we're going to keep releasing new episodes on schedule every week, every Wednesday. So definitely make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live. And if you're looking for even more help when it comes to creating pro-sounding mixes from your home studio, definitely make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com. That is a website where I've got a ton of great resources to help make the process of recording, editing, and mixing your music easy. And on the website, we've got some courses, we've got books, we've got coaching programs, and a whole bunch more. So if you're looking for help, definitely make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com. And one resource that I would definitely recommend you start off with is a book called The Mixing Mindset. That is a book where I break down the process of mixing step by step, showing you what you should be listening for, what tools to be using, how to dial in settings, so that ultimately you can get the sound that you hear in your head to come out of your speakers. So definitely make sure to check that out. It's called The Mixing Mindset, and that's available at MasterYourMix.com. So that is it for this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, guys. Really looking forward to chatting with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@MasterYourMix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.